Good afternoon.
So we're in part 5 of internal family systems today. So I think some of you are attending for the first time. So we'll do a quick catch up before we move on to the next in the series. So what we did is in the first 4 parts was to begin with, of course, an introduction to internal family systems, which it's primarily a psychotherapeutic technique which was founded by Dr. Richard Schwartz. And it's still evolving in the sense that people are still looking at various kinds of applications of IFS. Initially, it began purely as a psychotherapy technique, and now people are looking at IFS in multiple areas of life, like IFS in the area of conflict resolution, or IFS in terms of purely self-dialoguing and self-healing. So there are multiple spaces in which it's getting used, and it's also getting integrated with other techniques as we go along. Like a lot of practitioners are using internal family systems in conjunction with NLP or in conjunction with hypnosis and so on. So it's quite an interesting emergence that's happening as we speak. So the premise of IFS is that all of us have a central core, which in IFS language it is called the self. So the self is that part of us that's aware of our purpose, it is aware of why we exist, it is what is called the seat of consciousness. And apart from the self, which is the central core, we also have a lot of these other parts. And these parts play various roles in our lives, like we may have an internal father, an inner mother, inner child, and so on. And these parts assume various roles. So the primary roles, according to IFS theory, are that they are either a manager, which means the part allows us to function on a day-to-day basis. It's that aspect of us that takes control of our lives and helps us be operational, and it helps us be functional on a regular basis. So that's the manager part. We also have parts that are what are called protectors. Protector parts are parts that emerge when we tend to touch a space which could be extremely emotional and hurtful in nature. It could be a memory that's not so pleasant and we don't really want to deal with it. So these protector parts emerge when we are beginning to touch those hurtful parts, so that we actually don't go ahead and touch it. And what do these protector parts do? They may do different things. Sometimes they may help us functionally move away from the hurtful emotions or hurtful memories. Sometimes they may do that, but in a dysfunctional manner. So for example, a protector may sometimes make us feel addicted to alcohol, for example, so that we don't touch emotions or thoughts or feelings that can be hurtful. So it becomes a mechanism to avoid certain things. So there's a manager part, there's a protector part, and there is ultimately an exiled part. Exiled parts are those parts of us that are exiled in the sense they're sent away, they're deeply suppressed, they're still held within our memory, but we try not to consciously access them because these are extremely hurtful. So an exiled part could be memory of something extremely traumatic, maybe the loss of somebody, maybe some kind of an abuse, some kind of extreme trauma that we don't really want to go back to. Right? So we have already gone through that experience in the past and the mind doesn't want to go back to it, and therefore the job of the protector part is to really keep us away from the exile. Now the protector has a choice in terms of how to keep us away from the exile. So sometimes it chooses a functional path, sometimes it chooses a dysfunctional path, like it can make us alcoholic or get into substance abuse or any of that. So you have various kinds of parts of us, and therefore that entire process is also called internal family systems, because it's like a family. There is a central patriarch or a matriarch, which is the self, and then there are all these family members which have sometimes good and sometimes not so good relationships with each other. The idea of the entire IFS process is that ultimately all parts are there to serve the self, which is the core part. all parts, regardless of how dysfunctional they may seem, have a useful purpose. Right? So no part is there to cause harm to us. Yes, the behavior that is initiated by the part may not really be useful sometimes, but the part in itself doesn't mean harm. The part really wants to protect us. So the idea is to look at how best can we make this internal family functional so that whatever happens outside of us is also mirroring a very good functional relationship that exists inside. So in the previous parts we spoke about various aspects or various kinds of parts that we deal with. We spoke about how do we handle the protector part. We spoke about how do we handle the inner critic, which is a very common part that exists in most of us. And the last time around we also spoke about the language of the parts, which is a very powerful thing to use. It's really simple, but what the language of the parts says is that when we feel something that is unpleasant or not so nice, so let's say I'm feeling angry or I'm feeling extremely upset or I'm feeling very depressed, the language of the parts helps us to isolate the part and say that, okay, there is a part of me that is very angry. Instead of owning up the emotion and making the whole of me angry, the purpose of using the language of the parts is to keep ourselves in a resourceful state. So if I say, for example, that I am angry with you, the whole of me is angry with the whole of you, there's really little space for dialogue between us. You can't really sort it out because I am angry and I don't want to talk to you anymore. Whereas what the invitation here is to say that, okay, there is a part of me that is angry with a part of you that did this or said this. So what happens in the process is we are clearing up space for dialogue by saying that yes, there is conflict between a part of me and a part of you, but there are also other parts of us which are alive and well and which are seeing this and which can actually do something about it. So it doesn't become a judgmental process or a rejection process, but it opens up space for dialogue. So using the language of the parts is a very powerful process, and that's something that I would certainly encourage all of us to really work more towards. You can also refer to the part 4 of IFS, the talk on YouTube, that explains the language of the part further in detail. For today, we're looking at one particular part, which is the anxious part. So very often there is a part within us which is anxious. And it could be anxious about various things. It may not be a perpetually existing part. It could sometimes crop up and then it dies its own death once that anxiety is no longer needed. But sometimes when it crops up in a very dysfunctional manner. So the part of us that is anxious is usually playing the role of a protector. Right? So there is something that we are anxious about, which means we are jittery about it, we're feeling almost scared, fearful, apprehensive about something. And the anxious part comes up to say, okay, don't do it. Don't go anywhere close to that particular activity or person or thing that we are anxious about. But while it's a very commonly existing emotion, it is also a dysfunctional emotion because anxiety locks up a lot of our energy, and therefore it's something that we really need to actively work with. So, as like all other parts that we deal with in IFS, the basis or the assumption is that anxiety has its use. It is a useful part and therefore we don't need to condemn it or judge it. It's alright if the emotion of anxiety arises in us. It has its purpose and it does need its own space and time to tell its story. Its story in the sense, why does it exist? So it is important that we come to a space where we can actually dialogue with that anxious part of us and say, hey, I understand that you exist. Can we talk? Can you tell me why do you exist? What are you trying to protect me from? What is it that you're getting anxious about? But to come to that space sometimes is difficult, especially when you're in a high anxiety mode, and in that in that moment it is a little difficult to separate the self from the anxious part. So, which is where it helps to speak the language of the parts as a matter of habit and not just as a matter of process. So,
I got a question.
Yes.
We have heard something called anxiety disorder. What exactly is that?
Anxiety disorder is when that part dominates the self. Right? So
you don't have a control over it.
Yes, so you've let the anxiety build up to such a degree that it dominates all other emotions that are present in you. And therefore it is now a disorder. You can't really control it unless you use some kind of an external suppressant.
It is one kind of hypertension or what?
It may lead to hypertension. Yes. So anxiety disorder in itself is a mental condition, but it can have a psychosomatic impact of hypertension or related heart disorders as well. So here we're talking about the preventive measures that we can look at in terms of how do we start identifying that this anxious part exists in early stages so that it doesn't come to the stage of a disorder in the first place. So some of the things that can help us identify are to check, are we feeling helpless about a certain situation? If there is any kind of a situation in life which could be, let's say, an exam for a student or a financial issue for an adult, which could be a child being unwell, any of these situations where we feel helpless, that's one kind of a situation where anxiety generally tends to start building up and it starts thriving. It becomes like a fuel. The helplessness becomes a fuel for the anxiety to start generating. Why does helplessness come up? Is because we believe that in that moment we have insufficiency of something. It could be insufficiency of information, of resources, of things you can do, of money, anything. There is some sense of, I don't have enough to deal with the situation. That's the belief that we carry when there is a sense of helplessness. So at one level, if you are able to tackle at the belief level and say that, okay, I may not have enough, let's say I don't have enough money to deal with the situation, do I have something else that can substitute? Can I deal with it in some other way? Is there a possibility of going out of the box and thinking differently in that situation? That's one way of dealing with it at the NLP level, but you can also deal with it later at the IFS level in terms of simply dialoguing with that anxiety. So helplessness is one state which we need to be aware of, where the moment you identify that I'm feeling helpless, you know that the anxious part is growing, and that's a good time to start engaging with it and not suppress it, but really dialogue with it and say, hey, okay, I understand you're feeling helpless. Can we talk? Can we see what is it that you're feeling helpless about? Yet another clue is when you feel overstimulated, overwhelmed by something. Like sometimes there's an overload of information, there's too much that you need to grasp and figure out before you make a decision. Sometimes you're overwhelmed with work, that there's way too much to do and you don't think you can meet your deadlines. There's way too much to study before an exam. Right? All of these are cases where you feel overstimulated, there's just way too much to handle. That's again very good fodder for anxiety to come up. Yet another instance is where there is a sense of incongruity in the environment, where incongruity is when we have conflicting information. Right? So let's say we have two people that are very dear to us and they have a conflict, and you hear one side of the story and you get a certain angle to it, and later the same day you hear another side of the story which seems to be completely contradicting what the first person said, and that's incongruity, and you are engaged emotionally on both sides because both these people are dear to you, and therefore it becomes very difficult for you to be available to both of them equally because you really don't know who to trust. There is a sense of conflict in the environment. That again can cause anxiety if you're very engaged in the situation, if you're very attached to the people involved. And of course, a very common cause of anxiety is the situation of unpredictability, where we don't know what the future brings, and there is a lot that's hinged on it. So these could be situations like you've taken a major exam and the result is awaited and your future depends on it. Or there's a very important presentation or interview at work and there's a lot at stake there. Or perhaps you've invested a lot of money in one particular project or some kind of an investment, and then the market crashes and you don't know what happens next. So any sense of uncertainty of outcome is a good breeding ground again for anxiety. So the idea of outlining these expressions is to figure out, can we nip it in the bud? Can we start dealing with anxiety before it overcomes us, before it gets into a disorder? So at any point, if you feel that you're dealing with a sense of helplessness or unpredictability, incongruity, or overwhelm, it's important to start distancing and dialoguing from the anxiety right at that point in time. So, and why do we need to deal with it is, of course, because anxiety, if you let it build up, it has not very great consequences. It, of course, takes up a lot of our mental and emotional space because we spend a lot of time brooding over it and thinking about it, and that's not particularly healthy physically as well as mentally. And yes, if sustained anxiety can lead to depression, and there are enough clinical studies to back that up. So it's important that if there is a sense of anxiety that lives on for more than a few hours, it's important to start tackling it and not let it settle within us. So how do we dialogue with anxiety? There are various ways in which we can do this. First, of course, it's important to slow down in whatever manner you can slow down. So body work is a very important part of the IFS technique, the internal family systems technique. So it really helps to understand the moment you're feeling anxious, look at what happens to your body. How does anxiety express itself through your body? For some of us, it could be very short breaths. Some of us, it could be a sense of palpitation or sweating or a sense of pacing up and down. You're not able to sit still at one place.
Shivering body also.
Shivering, yeah, if there's extreme nervousness, you could be shivering. Mouth goes dry. All of those are symptoms of anxiety. It's very important to take note of that body sensation and give it some time to really physically calm down. So when we say slow down as the first step, physically slow down. So find that space, even if it's 5 minutes and you know you're going to get late to a meeting, it's alright, just 5 minutes, sit calmly on a chair, let the body slow down. The reason that's important is because when we're doing any kind of parts work, IFS is also referred to as parts work, it's important that the body feels a sense of safety and peace before it starts opening up and the parts start coming out to dialogue. So it's important that physically there is some kind of a space for you to slow down, simply breathe, just stare at the wall if nothing else. Very importantly, once you have slowed down, don't focus on the parts that react to the anxiety. And this is counterintuitive sometimes, but it's important to do this in the sense that a lot of times we are taught that when you feel anxious or nervous, curb it, don't think about it, just go ahead and perform. But it's important that you don't get into a level of suppressing the anxiety. It's alright, it's just that all we need to do is, while the anxious part comes up, there will also be a part of us that's judging the anxiety and saying, no, I shouldn't be feeling nervous, I shouldn't be feeling this, I shouldn't be feeling this. And it's important that that part quietens down. Let the anxiety be there and let this part that's reacting to the anxiety, which means sometimes, for example, a lot of people who are scared of public speaking, if you have to go to a stage and present, they feel nervous before they are about to give a talk, and the more they come closer to the stage, they also feel nervous about the fact that they are feeling nervous. So there is a part of them that's anxious, and there's another part of them that's reacting to the anxiety and saying you shouldn't be anxious, and that makes them more anxious. It only counters it has a very counterproductive impact. So what we're saying is, don't let the reactive parts emerge too much. Let them, if they come up, but don't pay attention. Just let them. Which means there is an internal dialogue that needs to go on that says it's okay to be anxious. Right? So own up the anxiety at one level, saying that a part of me is feeling anxious, a part of me is feeling nervous, and it's all right to feel that. Give yourself permission to feel anxious. That's a very important part of the process. At this point, there are multiple routes that you can take. The simplest thing that works for most people is to use meditative techniques to create a space for dialogue. So, if you're a practitioner of any kind of meditation, it could simply be observing your breath, or watching a candle, or listening to some kind of a music, going for a walk, whatever kind of meditative practice that you follow, certainly helps. That's the easiest way to start creating that space for dialogue. If you're not into a meditative kind of an environment, another thing that helps, if you have some private space, is to do what is called visual theatre. That's again a very common and a useful technique in internal family systems. Visual theatre is where you actually visually anchor your path. So you say that, okay, here is me, here is myself, which knows that there is a part of me that is anxious. Okay? And let me invite my anxious part to come here. Right? Let the anxious part get rooted here. And let the anxious part talk about what it is anxious about. And the anxious part might turn to myself and say that, hey, I'm very anxious about the fact that, let's say, there's a family member who's going through some medical issues and reports are coming in later today, and I don't know what's going to happen. It's a very serious issue, and the future of the family is at stake, and therefore I am very anxious. So what's happening in the process is the anxious part is getting some space to vent out. Otherwise, what can happen if the self claims the complete anxiety is that the self also goes into a freeze mode, because there is too much happening, the self can feel overwhelmed, and in the process, the resources that are otherwise available to the self, the logic, the sense of being organized and being able to tackle with the situation, that's no longer available if the self freezes. So the idea of visual theatre is, let the self be as it is, let the self stay functional. Right? Because even as you're dealing with the anxiety, there are things practically that need to be taken care of. You may still need to go to the hospital, you may need to negotiate with people, you may need to pay things. So it's important that the self is functional. So you're talking to the anxious part, let the anxious part pour out whatever it needs to pour out. In the process, sometimes other parts may also emerge. Right? So sometimes the anxious part may say that, okay, I am anxious because of these issues, and my anxiety is also building up because there is this inner critic which is telling me that I should not be anxious. Right? So for those of us who are conditioned not to become upset, not to become angry, not to become nervous, could have an inner critic also that's living in us, which says, no, you shouldn't feel this, you should stay functional no matter what, you shouldn't become emotional. Right? So there is a critic part of us. So let that critic also take its place in the visual theatre, and let the critic come up and speak and say that, okay, yes, I'm telling you the part that is anxious, I'm telling you that you shouldn't become anxious because I am concerned that you will no longer be functional. Right? Let the critic express his or her point of view, and let all the three or four or as many parts as come up in the dialogue, let them anchor in these visual spaces around and have a quick dialogue, at the end of which they can make requests to each other. So the anxious part may request the critic part within us to say that, okay, listen, I understand that you don't want me to become more anxious because you need to stay functional, there are practicalities to be dealt with, but could you please stop criticizing in this moment, let me just come up, right? And the critic part may accept that request and calm down. Similarly, the self may make a request of the anxious part to say, alright, tell me your story, what is it that is making you so hyper, so anxious, and can be dialogue, what are your fears, outline your fears, and we will see how best we can deal with them. We're not saying the fears can't exist, but it's alright, let's talk, let's deal with those issues. So that's one very powerful way of dealing with anxiety. I find that the visual theatre works very well, especially when you have somebody guiding you through the process, because sometimes if you're alone and extremely anxious, the anxious part might sometimes take over and it becomes the dominant part of the proceedings.
And it is that what happens, you know.
Actually, if you're a little used to the language of the parts, it's not very difficult. But yeah, if you're not used to that, yes, it's possible that it might dominate. So it really helps to have somebody be there in the room with you. It doesn't even have to be somebody who's well versed in it, but somebody who's just holding the space for the self and saying that come back here. You know, acknowledge the fact that there is the self which is beyond the anxious part. Somebody needs to be a constant reminder for that, so that the anxiety doesn't take over. So that visual theatre is something that works very beautifully. I find that that's the quickest mode of resolution. And a lot of times in sessions we found that 10 minutes of theatre and it's done. The person walks out feeling calm. You acknowledge the anxiety, it's not that it goes away, it's just that it stops taking you over, it doesn't make you freeze.
It's all about dealing with your own self, not involving others.
Yeah, IFS is primarily about setting the internal family right. The belief being that your internal relationships will also reflect the external relationship. So let's say if you have an inner parent that is very critical, it's very likely that that's mirroring an external parent. If you're able to correct the relationship internally, the external relationship shifts because your responses to the external parent shifts. So it's a cyclical effect there. So yeah, it is a lot to do with working with oneself, but the idea is that your mirror, whatever is inside is mirroring what's outside and the other way around. So the easiest way to shift relationships outside of us is to shift it within us. Because at the base of the theory, Dr. Schwartz says that these inner parts get created because we internalize outer relationships. So we internalize our mother, our father, our children, our things and people that are close to us. We internalize all of that and hold them. It's just that the moment that we have internalized that inner mother or inner father or anybody else, that moment may not, they may not have been at their best in that moment. So it's possible that we may have internalized a mother when she was very angry. But that doesn't mean that she's always angry, it's just that we start believing she's angry because that's the part that we have internalized. So the idea is resolve it, let the parts speak and get done with their story, because once the parts are allowed to state their story internally, they get released, because the reason they live within us is because we've not listened to them. So the idea is not so much to kill the parts, but to release them by allowing them to have their way in terms of speaking out what they exist for. And more often than not, every part that comes up tends to have a protective concern. It's always about safety, that I want to safeguard you from making this mistake, or I want to protect you from harm or a hurtful relationship or a certain behavior that's not productive. So it's always a sense of safety that these parts usually bring, no matter how dysfunctional ultimately their behaviors are. It's just that the behaviors driven by the parts become dysfunctional the more they are suppressed. The more you suppress a certain part, the more it will want to make itself heard by making you take up substance abuse or making you take up a certain emotion which is not productive, like being extremely angry or getting into violence or any of that. That happens only when the part doesn't have a chance to speak. So the idea is give it a chance to speak as much as possible. So meditative technique and then an internal dialogue always works easily if you're able to do that. Otherwise, visual theatre is, as I said, is the next best mode. Yet another technique that works, that you might experiment with, it doesn't work personally for me as much, but I know a lot of people who work with it, is to write. So you write, so you take up 2-3 different pages, and each page, you actually have a dialogue between the parts, like a screenplay of a movie. You create these characters, you have the self, you have the anxious part, you have the angry part, you have all these parts, and there's a dialogue that happens. And some people, especially people who tend to process through writing, people who like to write diaries and journals, they work very well through that method. So that's another way of dialoguing with the anxious part. So that's that. But yeah, in summation, it's important that we deal with anxiety the earlier the better. Because the later the anxiety is dealt with, the chances are it either builds up into panic or it builds up into depression. So both ways it's pretty harmful. So for those of you who can work with meditation on this, there's one particular meditation that I find particularly helpful in this context. It's called the presence practice. You can find it on a YouTube channel called Shakti Leadership, and it's a quick, about 8-9 minute meditation, but I find it very centering. It acknowledges all the parts and it centers, and then it opens up that space for dialogue. So that's something you might want to try. So that's that.
Thank you.
And what's the relation?
Can you tell us something more about the presence picture? What exactly is that technique?
So the presence practice primarily states that when you talk of the concept of presence, what it says is that reality has only this moment, and the past is in our heads, the future is in our heads. Neither of them are real.
Psychological.
Right? So whatever can be done in actionable terms is only in this moment. Right? So the presence is the only real thing. Otherwise, it's all in our perception, in our heads. And in this moment, because this moment has never existed before, we have nothing to promote, we have nothing to defend. Whatever is there is only the moment and the resources that it has. So it's purely about grounding ourselves in this moment and saying, I'm here now. What can I do now? There is nothing in the past is a story in my head, the future is a story in my head. Neither of them are real. So I'm here now, what can I do now? That's the root of the practice.
What's the relation between anxiety and fear?
Anxiety, a lot of anxiety stems through fear. So when fear comes up as an emotion, anxiety stems as a response. So yeah, very often they are linked to each other. It's just that sometimes anxiety may not get to a degree of fear. Like let's say you have taken an exam and you're waiting for the result. You're anxious. You may not necessarily be fearful of what happens. If you're reasonably confident saying, okay, will I get 60% or 70%? Yeah, there is an anxiety around it. It doesn't have to be a degree of fear.
Eagerly waiting for it.
Yeah, there is apprehension because there is some uncertainty, but it doesn't have to be fear. On the other hand, yes, for some people the same situation can generate a sense of fear that if I fail or if I pass, if I fail I'm going to be thrown out of my family, yeah, then there is a sense of fear.
Over a point.
Yes, so when anxiety crosses a certain threshold, it can become fear.
Basically, most of your thoughts are based on your past experiences.
Yes.
Which you cannot change. Those past
So
experiences.
the idea is not really to change anything.
Okay, so then how do you deal with them? Because your thoughts are directly connected to your past experiences. So how do you deal with them in that time?
So the basis of this, or for that matter any therapeutic technique, is that You cannot change your past, you don't need to change your past. Having said that, it's important to acknowledge that the past ultimately is the story you have made up. Ultimately, there was an incident, you gave a certain meaning to the incident. Somebody else may have gone through the same incidents and not given the same meaning.
You turned it into your belief.
Yeah, so the more meaning you attach, the more complex it can become. So the idea is to unblend it. The idea is to say, there was an incident, I can learn from it and move on, or I can weave more story around it and stay there, but no point in staying there because it's
that
in my
dialogue
head.
you should do with your own self.
Yeah. So ultimately a lot of these processes are about unblending and saying, get away from the story. Because at the end of the day, none of that is real.
Yeah. You're supposed to hold on to those things.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.